tonight's talk from me is very much about gardening within a changing climate and what climate change means to the way we garden. But of course, gardens, like every other aspect of life, will not themselves be immune from some of the issues around climate change. Climate change is still very much the elephant in the room in terms of its implications for us as a society. And gardens are not different, they're not separated from all the other issues that we have to deal with in terms of a changing climate and sustainability agendas in general. And of course, if we see big changes in population, people struggling to grow food in other parts of the world, it will have implications for us. We may see greater migration. However, there's a key point here, is that our green spaces themselves can help deal with some of the issues that climate change will bring to us. And maybe we should be thinking now about the right types of green spaces to make our living environment that a little bit more amiable and resistant to some of the issues that will come with climate change. So we don't really know how gardens will fit in the future, but it may be that we lose them as there's more pressure on housing, or we may see they're actually encouraged more by policymakers because they help basically the city breathe and mitigate some of the issues with climate change. And of course, physical aspects also affect the way our society changes. How will we use these spaces if the weather changes, if the climate changes? Will we spend more time outdoors? Will we use it more as a recreational environment? Or will we have other ways that we think of how our gardens are used? Gardens change with many other historical trends, and it's very likely that they'll also change as the climate changes. So let's just go back a little bit to what we think climate change will actually do to terms of everyday living. Now, of course, it's very political. We've had climate change deniers, we've had scientists say one thing. It is complex. Trying to understand how climate works isn't easy. It is quite literally almost astrophysics at times. So we don't really know exactly what the future's like. It's a brave person stands up and says it'll be like this or it'll be like that. However, when you talk to the meteorologists who have been studying this for the last 30, 40 years or so, they've increased the power of the computers to try and understand how the climate interacts and it works. And I guess one of the most encouraging thing from a scientific point of view about how we predict the future is when you take these big computer models and basically put them in reverse gear, because you can then model what would happen in the past and then relate it back to actually what did happen in the past. So this reverse gear helps us have some confidence as to what future climatic scenarios might look like, based on running it back and saying, you know what, it was quite warm in 1976 and the models suggested that would happen. But the rate of change and the final endpoints are still open to debate, of course, and that will depend with how much CO2 we pump into the atmosphere over the next few decades, and also other materials that we may work with and go into the atmosphere. And of course, there's a political manifesto to that, as to, Donald Trump's going on a sort of slightly anti-climate change impact. So does that mean we delay the times that we actually deal with some of these issues? So it's difficult to know exactly where you're likely to be. But I think we're going to trouble. And the point is, we don't know how much trouble we're in. Have we actually going to get a ticking off from the headmaster, we've been naughty boys and girls, or have we burnt the school down? And we're somewhere in that scenario. And we have to try and deal with that. So, in simple terms, what are the predictions for the UK? Well, it's going to get warmer. Climate change, global warming, it's not surprising. It isn't quite as simple as it just gets nice and evenly warmer. There will be turbulence along the way. We have greater volatility, greater turbulence in the system. So the fact that we sometimes get changes in weather that we don't predict is all part of these models. They all suggest it will get a little bit more bumpy. We will, in terms of gardeners, see an extension to the growing season, but we may also have peak rain periods, peak droughts, etc. during those processes. We're likely to see a bit more rain in winter, and for most parts of the UK, less rain in summer, except the northwest. The northwest will rain in summer. I'm saying nothing. We are likely to see more storminess though, so stronger winds, stronger downpours of rain. Rather than rain being sort of evenly spaced, it will come down in big dollops at times. and we're going to have infrastructure, cities and towns that cope with that type of scenario. We're also going to have longer drier spells, particularly in the southeast, so that the idea of struggling to water the garden will become more common, at least for some parts of the country. And also there's other artefacts such as storm surges and things where we just get more energy in the sea and we'll get these coastal floods being a bit of an issue. In reality, all we've seen since they started sort of monitoring climate change is an increase of about 0.85 degrees, not even a whole degree yet. However, we have seen an increase in the growing season by 1 month. So even a relatively small increase in average temperature has quite big implications for us as gardeners. And one of the things we're worried about in the future is that it gets a little bit warmer, we get a little bit less rain, but we also get much greater transpiration and evapotranspiration from our plants in our gardens. And that means we're much more likely to get into drought scenarios more quickly. In this image here, you can see this sort of red blob around London. Well, that's the likelihood of getting a drought in the summer. These soils tend to lose more water than they gain in an average year. But look how much that extends in one of the climate change scenarios. Basically, the whole of the southeast and the east gets into a situation where there isn't enough water for crops or for gardens. And then we have to start thinking about moving water around to create what the crops need. So as gardeners, I guess very much the message from tonight is about resilience. It's about coping with these changes, dealing with these issues, and also being flexible and adaptable to that. And so some of the things we traditionally have done in gardens might need to change, and some of the problems we may have to try and solve in different ways. But we do need to be tough, we need to remain resilient, we have to think about the issues and just go with the flow sometimes. And because of this greater volatility, turbulence in the system, we're also going to have a sort of less predictable scenarios. Well, gardeners deal with that all the time. You never know when the next frost's coming, when the next heavy downpour's coming. But we will have to deal with it more frequently. And as somebody that just repaired his mother's garden shed over the weekend, having built it about 18 months ago, that's not an unusual scenario. So the idea of physical structures, or battened fences and cloches and things like that we've put up, they will get a battering from time to time, and we do need to think about building them better, or at least being flexible about how we deal with that. And of course we're used to strong winds, particularly up in the northwest in the winter. However, trees totally can cope with winter storminess. What they're not very good at is dealing with storminess when they've got all their leaves on. And if you remember that storm back in the 1980s and which hit the south, it was because a lot of the trees still had quite a lot of foliage on during that October period. So if we get unpredictable weather, particularly early autumn or late spring, and we get a big blow, then we'll find a lot of our infrastructure, our trees particularly, are that much more susceptible to damage. And we're already seeing things like city councils think about the types of trees that they might plant in future. And I guess in simple terms, we're thinking of either smaller trees, because they'll just resist the wind, they won't get the same impact of the wind, or these columnar fastigiate types, the upright types. So we may see a change in some of the gardening styles and designs based on what just copes with the wind. We also have a few favourites that are really quite tough. Anybody that's sort of wandered across Hadrian's Wall will know about the sycamores, good for exposed sites, but there's also other species such as the Corsican pine that we can use in future as shelter belts because they have some resistance to the wind. And then within landscaping terms, we can be a wee bit snooty about some of the plants that we use at times, but it's likely that what are called in the term shopping centre car park plants, basically the tough ones, your Buddleias, your Cotoneastas, your Berberis, these are the guys that are likely to do quite well in the future. They're tough for a reason, and that's why we plant them around our city centres and roundabouts and things. And they've got these sort of resilience factors, and it's likely that we'll rely more on these sorts of plants because they are a little bit more adaptable and a little bit more tough. But when we think about tough, what makes a tough plant? As a scientist, that's quite a difficult challenge. People come on and say, what plants do we plant for the future? What's tough enough? And it's difficult for us to actually define that. So we've done some research for the RHS in recent years looking on what we mean by resilience or toughness to some of these climate change scenarios we're predicting. And it asks the questions, are some plants tougher than others, and if so, why? And are native species tougher than cultivated forms, or is it the other way around? So we've actually focused on primula as being quite a good model subject to look at, using the native primrose as our basis, but then variation in cultivated forms, primula wand on the right there, for example. And one of my PhD students has looked at plants that have some commonality. The flowers are quite similar for at least 3 of the cultivars, the native primrose on the left there, but cottage cream, which often you mistake for the native primrose in the garden centre, but also Alaska, which is a bigger flowered version, and then a very different, highly cultivated form, what's called Forza. And she was just looking at how these plants coped if we gave them an artificial drought or we gave them an artificial waterlogging, a heavy downpour, and would they all respond in the same way? We were quite cruel. We took these plants and we sort of denied water from them, or we stuck them in a bucket for 2 weeks and let them struggle on. And we saw which ones could bounce back once we put them back into normal watering. So they were given periods of drought and periods of waterlogging and swapped over. In the case of the Primula vulgaris, our native primrose, that's the one in the top, it bounced back quite quickly. It coped with these artificial stress factors that we put on it. In contrast, the more cultivated forms and the more fancy basically they got, the more susceptible they were to these artificial stress factors. So I'm afraid to say it was the poor Forza, the bright coloured pinky one, which is the bottom graph. Basically, its quality scores all dropped away very quickly. It had very little resilience. It wasn't in the tough group. However, our native primrose was showing the opposite trend. It had quite a lot of resilience and tolerance to these stress factors. So that was quite interesting, because it means we can now go and talk to the garden industry about how they might think about plants in the future. But it also has implications for what are our common and attractive plants. So for example, are we going to lose the big floral, the big heavy bloomed roses in favour of more simple species and some of the hardier species that are out there? And that's our next question. Are some of the trends we've seen in primula going to work in things like pansy, petunia, rose, etc.? However, we hope it means that the breeders will not just think about flower colour and flower size in the breeding programmes in the future, but also what makes a plant tough and resilient to some of these weather factors. So I talked about the northwest being that bit wetter, potentially even in summer and in winter. I think it is fair to say that we will see a gradient from the southeast to the northwest, already exists, but possibly a polarisation of that. And it is the southeast that's largely going to be hit by more consistent drought periods, and it's probably the northwest that's still going to get a lot of the storms, but there will be switching between the two from time to time. So if we take the first scenario, which is basically coping with drier, warmer summers, again we're anticipating that we're already seeing it, more Mediterranean plants being used. When I qualified in horticulture, you were lucky if you could get an olive to survive outdoors in winter. Now in London it's a common landscape plant. So we'll see more Mediterranean species. We'll see some of these more drought adapted plants coming in, at least for some of the locations we're interested in. The interesting thing with Mediterranean plants is they can actually cope with quite wet winters. What they don't like are wet summers. They're actually adapted in their native environment to get quite a lot of rainfall, but that rainfall tends to drain away quite quickly. What they don't like is sitting in puddles in the summer. Other species, though, that we want to hang on to will be much more dependent on our water capture and artificial irrigation. So we need to think more imaginatively how we're going to use water off the house to supply water to the garden. And that might mean actually thinking not just within an individual garden scale, but linking gardens together. Linking, we've got compost butts, but we've also got water butts, but they don't hold an awful lot of water off your house. They might irrigate the greenhouse for maybe 5 or 6 days before you run out. So we need to think at a bigger scale, a neighbourhood scale, how we capture and use water. And you can see some images here, how it's been done in Paris, where they're beginning to think about SUD systems, sustainable urban drainage systems, where water runs off a whole neighbourhood and then it's held and then reused by that neighbourhood as and when it needs that water supply. And this was very much a theme within the garden that we put on at Chatsworth last month, on this idea of capturing water and reusing it more effectively. So you'll actually see the sort of canvas there at the top. Now you've got to use a bit of imagination. Imagine there's a house in the background somewhere, and this is our patio in front of the back of the garden. So that canopy is keeping us shady during the summer, but also when we have a downpour, it's capturing the water that would normally just hit the patio and run to the drain. And it's capturing it, and it's going into, you can't see it very well, but there are water storage tanks under the patio. So we can capture water and hold it, and hold quite big quantities of it. Any excess, however, runs down the chain that you can see there into an overflow system. So the garden itself is designed as a resilient feature to hold water when we get a lot of it, and then reuse that water to supply water to the plants when we need it. So we need to think about garden design and that interaction with rain. However, we will see drier trends, and that has implications for the way plants will also perform. So we might actually get shortening periods of some of our spring blossom. It was good to see this year that our rhododendrons actually flowered for quite a long time, but we may see contraction of things like cherry blossom, rhododendron blossom, if we get drier periods. And conversely, those species that flower more than once in the summer, our roses for example, we might find them going on for longer, starting earlier and going on for longer into the autumn. And we actually may see some of the different periods of the garden, the bedding plants, the different types of bedding plants, begin to blur together, that the spring stuff goes longer and the summer stuff moves earlier. And if we think of our garden trees, there's going to be some winners and losers too. So in a drier climate, things like Acer palmatum, the Japanese maples, who tend to like quite a high moisture, quite a high shade environment, may begin to struggle if they begin to crisp up and burn in the summer. Things like our sorbices, which come from the mountains of the Himalayas and other places, again may also struggle with drier periods. However, in contrast, gladiolus, rhamnus, robinias all may become more common, particularly common street trees and things like that, just because we're going to get longer, drier summers. It won't all be about Mediterranean though. We may find a slightly more tropical look, particularly where there's more moisture as well as warmth. So Cornwall, the southwest example, West Wales, we might see some of the more tender plants that are challenging at the minute having more of a mainstay. And we may get mixed compositions where you've got some Mediterranean plants, but also big leaf things like the golden catalpa there being used within the garden design. So mixing and matching slightly different styles as long as the plant is tough enough. So that was the dry scenario. How do we deal with this heavy rain? It might be, certainly from my part of the world in Glasgow, it might be a slightly more challenging prospect. And of course, it isn't just about the rain. The rain gathers and then overflows these rivers and ends up in our backyards as well. So it's about flooding through the rain as well as just heavy downpours from time to time. Well, actually, as I said earlier, as far as a plant's concerned, they can usually cope with wet in the winter. Apart from anything else, they're not growing, they're dormant. Summer is a challenge for them. So a big flooding event in the summer is often what will kill a plant off. And that's just because the temperatures are higher. And when a plant floods, it actually just, it drowns, it literally can't breathe, the roots can't breathe. And higher temperatures mean that there's less oxygen, the oxygen depletes much more quickly. So the worst scenario is wet and warm. Wet and cold, the plant can usually cope with. We're also likely to see a bit more erosion. So anybody's on a heavy clay soil, you'll see these rivulets forming, especially if you've got bare soil. So there may well be moves to sort of have terrace gardens, raised beds, and a better way to just manage moisture movement across the top of the soil itself. And the way we even apply our fertilisers, it might be encouraged for bulky manures that hold the nutrients there rather than liquid fertilisers where it drains through the system quite quickly. And then in terms of food production, again, one of the challenges in terms of fruit is actually if we get warmer winters, we won't get the natural chilling that fruit formation, bud formation requires, bud development requires. So things like our black currants, our raspberries and the apples all require a period of chilling in the winter for them to flower properly in the spring. And we don't get good fruit set if we don't have that chilling period. However, warmer summers will mean that we can begin to grow those things that are, again, traditionally more associated with warmer climates. So olives, grapes, even some of the more hotter peppers might be grown outdoors. If you're a veg gardener, then the challenges are there too. You potentially could get bigger crops, but that means that if you've got water. Same, if you don't get enough chilling, then you may find things like cauliflower aren't forming their curds properly. Anybody got a clay soil? Anybody on clay? So the challenges of clay, of course, are that it's heavy and difficult in the wet winter, and then in the summer it goes like a brick. You can hardly get the fork of the spade in. So all that traditional stuff you've learned as gardeners about more organic matter is still there. We need to improve our soil to feed the plants properly. And we'll see clay soils becoming more and more difficult to work without that organic matter, and likewise sandy soils, again, not holding moisture and being more prone in the summer. So we may need to change our attitudes a bit flexibility again, repeat sowing dates to cover some of the risks. I'm afraid to say we'll still have slugs. Nobody's got rid of slugs yet. They're like the warm and the wet, certainly. And that's really what we're thinking the future will look like in terms of a traditional gardener's approach. I guess one of the things that I've been quite interested in doing in the university is actually looking at the value of gardens in the climate change, and actually in some of the wider scenarios that we're facing at the minute. Changes in the way our cities are designed, changes in population and things. So we're trying to think a little bit more about what does the garden do for us in basic terms. And I guess the interesting thing is that there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that gardens make quite a positive contribution to our urban environment. They will actually help us deal with some of the issues that climate change will bring, but we actually have to engage with the policymakers to make sure they understand that element. So what do we know about gardens? How important are they when we design a city or a new town? Well, some of the statistics are quite interesting. Almost a third of our cities are actually gardens. Much a third of the total urban space is down to gardening. You never hear it talked about in the 10 o'clock news. Nobody says, save the garden because it helps the city breathe. But it's a third of our urban space is that back plot or front garden that we have. And that has a significant implication if we're trying to protect our towns from flooding or excessive heat, because the garden is providing that little bit of nature that usually moderates and mitigates some of these effects. So we're trying to understand more about the role of green space and gardens in particular in making our cities more resilient to climate change, reducing the temperatures in the summer, mitigating effects of flooding, but also things like air pollution, which are part of that process of a warming climate. So some of my research in recent years has been looking at green wall systems, both the slightly artificial type that have irrigation running down the walls, keeping plants alive, and the more conventional type that probably most of us are familiar with, a clematis or a wisteria or a rose up over the front of the building. And we know that these can actually help cool the building in the summer. You see it in the tropical places. They have big trees. The villages are often situated under a big tree, and that's providing quite a strong cooling effect. Now, we don't experience that many heat waves in Britain, but we may do in the future. And this idea of actually using vegetation to keep the building cool has gained some interest. So if you're going to keep your building cool, what would you plant? What would be your first choice? Come on, keen gardeners out there.
Trees. Trees.
What sort of trees?
With deciduous.
Deciduous, yeah. Any particular type?
One that transpires a lot.
One that transpires a lot, yeah. One that's got big leaves to shade you, and one that transpires a lot. So one of the problems I have in my life is that I talk to policymakers, I talk to city councillors, and they say, we understand green infrastructure, green space, and we'll put some in. But they never come back and talk to us about what they mean by that. Is it a bit of lawn? Is it a few box bushes? Is it a forest? Nobody ever seems to talk about that level of detail. But actually, if you get down to the detail, plants work in different ways. Not all green space is the same in its ability to provide a service to us. But this is the cooling effect on a wall of different plant types. Hedera, that's ivy, cherry laurel, fuchsia, honeysuckle and jasmine. Jasmine's the one in the red. They're all plants we might find on or near a wall. And actually the ivy is providing the greatest cooling. It shades and it evapotranspires. And it's providing us with about -7 degrees. That's 7 degrees cooler than the air in front of the wall. The air behind the bush, behind the plant, is 7 degrees cooler than the air in front of the wall, because we've put an ivy bush there. For the keen gardeners who can see from the front here, the one on the left, the deep blue one, is Stachys lanata. In my part of the world, what we call lamb's ears. That's that silver leafy little plant. It's not, to be fair, a very common wall shrub. It's a Mediterranean sub-shrub. But it does have immense cooling power. It reflects a lot of the heat, it then shades the wall, and it also evapotranspires. So you've got a difference between about 4 degrees of cooling and about 7 or 8 degrees of cooling just by choosing the right plant. Again, it's not a real big issue for somebody coming from Glasgow, but if you're in London, urban heat island events are now common. Excessive heat during the summer is an issue. And we know that parks and other green spaces can provide significant local cooling, about 6 degrees cooling. And if you're ever in the city centre of London or even Manchester and you move out to the suburbs, you can get almost a 10-degree difference in hot days just by having more green space around you. And if when you talk about our own thermal comfort, that's quite a significant factor. And interesting, a great study done by Manchester University a few years ago basically said that if they increased the amount of parks in the city of Manchester by about 10%, it would completely eliminate the climate change model for the next 100 years. It would provide 4 degrees of cooling to the city, which is the predicted increase the city will have in the next 100 years. So with respect to climate change, we want to think a bit more about how plants can interact with the wind and can improve house insulation. They can also reduce the carbon footprint if we're producing our own food, locally produced food, encouraging allotments, encouraging space around us, growing fruit on walls can also help this idea of reducing moving food from one place to another, as well as actually capturing carbon and sticking it back in the soil. Now, again, it's not something we will necessarily worry about too much on a warming climate. But if you take today's scenarios about winter and cold snaps during the winter, again, we've done some studies about how plants can insulate. So if it goes back to this idea of our wisteria or our ivy up the front of a house, you can see this thermal image on the left here, and you see all the red colours. That's heat leaking away from the house. In most cases, the front living room. And the very bit that's losing most heat is actually off the roof. But we're losing a lot of heat at the minute just by not insulating our buildings. So we've asked the question, what happens if you actually put a wall plant or a shrubbery around a built structure? How does that affect energy performance and energy loss? Now, however much I tried, nobody would give me 20 houses to play with. Put trees up and take them down again. And I have to ask lots of people, could you give me a big housing scheme that I can play with? However, as a scientist, we have to replicate our studies. One house doesn't sell the story. We have to get some statistics on these things. We have to reproduce our experiments. So this is my idea of a mini city. The photograph on the right, believe it or not, that's Chicago. Well, it's my sort of equivalent of Chicago. Lots of little tower blocks, and in this case, surrounded by winter snow. But again, for the sharp-eyed amongst you, some of the blocks were covered with ivy plants and some were left bare. And we put a water tank in them in the middle, and we heated it to about 16 degrees. And you see the bare brick block there at the bottom again, the heat just oozing out the sides of the block. So we decided to look at how much energy we used over the winter just by having bare blocks against vegetated blocks. And actually we got about a 30 to 40% reduction in energy use by having some vegetation around the brick mini building. And it was about 2 to 3 degrees warmer. You could actually feel the heat behind the ivy plants. Now we need to replicate that up. We need to go back to real buildings and look at what we could do. But potentially a third of saving of energy. So why is it not the Banner News? Why is the Telegraph and the Observer not banging on about it? because we have to do experiments. But it is potentially important to think about the benefits that the natural world can bring before we think of other forms of insulation. So we know that one or two of these issues, green space is useful, gardens are useful. The one thing that policymakers do get excited about is gardens providing multiple benefits. If you're trying to build some of these things in with different factors, you're usually looking at single scenarios. But the garden and the proper type of green space seems to provide multiple benefits. It might not be quite as good as thermal in the inert forms of thermal insulation, but the fact it does part of the job, and it also traps and brings the rainwater in, it also provides homes for wildlife, it provides a range of benefits, and we've got to try and assess these multiple factors to really promote the idea of gardens and gardening. But the benefits are really quite significant, and I'm just going to deviate slightly away from climate change for a minute or two here, but they do provide habitat. They're actually essential for urban wildlife, the right style of garden. But they also allow our children and people who don't visit the countryside to understand the natural world, whether that's growing their own food or whether it's seeing a ladybird or a butterfly, because without these places they don't have that experience. And increasingly we're looking at how it affects our health, basically the psychological benefits of looking on a green space. And it's not just psychological. The fact is we want to engage, we want to run, we want to be more physically active in the green space than an equivalent grey space. And that has also implications such as community cohesion. We talk to the neighbours when there's a garden. If we don't have a garden, we don't even see our neighbours. Communities spontaneously occur around allotments because people are comparing and friendly rivalry and these sort of things. It has quite good, what they call, social capital, as well as reducing air and noise problems. So if you don't believe me, any sceptics out there, if you don't believe me, this is a summary of a lady called Frances Kuhl's work from America. And she's done about 5 or 6 different studies, and this is a summary of her data sets, as well as looking at other people's data. And she's looked at people who don't have everyday contact with nature, who live in highly urbanised worlds. And she's also accounted for income, other social factors. So it's just about whether you see green, you have contact with nature, or you don't. And over these multiple studies, the columns basically show your percentage increase in a medical condition when you don't have regular contact with nature. And probably the most interesting ones in the right-hand column, those 2 red blocks, a 30% increase in depression and a 40% increase in anxiety by just living in a completely urbanised environment. But even things like asthma, migraine, respiratory problems, coronary heart disease, some of the ones in the blue columns, increased incidence by not having regular contact with nature. And if you live in the town, what's one of the best ways to get regular contact with nature?
Parks.
And? It's at your front doorstep. So this is why the policymakers are beginning to get a bit more interested. So we need to understand a bit more about gardens and the services they provide to us in city living. They are not just luxuries. They seem to be providing significant benefits to us. And pardon my little sort of schematic there, but basically, simple round tree, noise baffle, traffic regulator, soil conditioner, crime stopper. There is evidence that green spaces reduce evidence of crime. Air filter, bird diner, stress buster, money spinner. 1 in 3 tourists who visit the UK will visit a garden when they're here. It's a huge economic benefit to the country. So, as gardeners, as citizens, how do we view our garden? Because the one thing I haven't really touched on is that gardens themselves are quite dynamic landscapes. And interestingly enough, they do actually reflect our attitudes to the wider natural world. They're at our doorstep, but they also are very much the way I introduce the wider world to us. So who's been out hoovering the lawn recently? Who's been putting down plastic grass? The other psychology is it's all about me, which is some good parts of it, because it's about artistic expression. I want to demonstrate my ego, I want to demonstrate my talent in the garden, but often I don't really care about other factors or other features. And for a number of people, of course, it is their little oasis, it is their Garden of Eden. It's their little bit of nature and their ability to get away from it all. Anyway, I've been banging on for long enough, so I'm just going to sum up. Gardens are part of the bigger picture. They are affected by social factors. They're not completely outside all the other issues we have to worry about. There are challenges and opportunities for us as gardeners, but we're used to that. We're used to unpredictability. It's just we just have to be more adaptable and more flexible. There will be new features that come into the garden to try and deal with some of the climatic impacts. But probably more than anything else, we need to realise and value the benefits that gardens and other green spaces bring us. And also recognise, of course, gardens mean different things to different people.